On June 1st, the war between Russia and Ukraine entered a new and impressive chapter. Ukraine launched a secret and highly bold operation called Spider Web Operation. This carefully planned and executed attack resulted in the destruction of approximately 34% of the Russian strategic bombers that were highlighted in 4 air bases throughout Russia. The number impresses not only by the number of aircraft destroyed, but mainly for its strategic value for the Russian war effort. Many of these planes were key platforms for long-range missions, including bombers capable of launching cruise missiles and even nuclear weapons. The destruction of about 1/3 of this fleet is not only a material but also symbolic impairment, directly affecting Russia's dissuasion and projection of power projection. What makes this attack even more surprising is the distance where it occurred. Unlike other military actions, which are usually concentrated near the front lines, the Spider Web operation was conducted thousands of kilometers from the combat zone, directly reaching the heart of Russia. Air bases that were until then considered protected and untouchable have been targeted by a drone-coordinated offensive that managed to break the defenses and reach high-value aircraft. This feat represents a milestone in the Ukrainian capacity to bring war into Russian territory, shaking not only military infrastructure, but also the perception of internal security that Kremlin tries to keep in front of the population and military elites. The political and military impact of this attack cannot be underestimated. Russia has suffered one of the biggest losses in its strategic aviation since the beginning of the conflict, and this humiliation will require, according to experts, an immediate and potentially violent response from Vladimir Putin. The Russian president, known internationally for his authoritarian and adamant stance, does not usually leave challenges unanswered. Since the beginning of the war, Putin has shown a clear willingness to resort to all options to maintain his image of power intact, both in the internal public and in the international scenario. Therefore, such a direct blow against one of the most important forces of its military apparatus will certainly trigger a rapid and blunt retaliation. Behind the scenes of Kremlin, sources indicate that there is already an intense movement in search of guilty. Rumors point out that Putin is especially focused on FSB, the Federal Security Service, responsible for the protection of the state and ensuring that operations such as Spider Web Operation are detected and neutralized before they can cause significant damage. The fact that this Ukrainian operation was planned and, according to some sources, even prepared from a place near the FSB headquarters in Chelyabinsk city, is seen as a very serious failure. This breach in internal security not only allowed the destruction of important Russian military assets, but also represents a public humiliation to Putin, which has always sold the image of a strong, efficient, and armored state against external threats. This episode is not only a military matter, but also deeply political. Putin needs, more than ever, to maintain his unquestionable authority in the face of the military elite and the oligarchs that support his power. The public humiliation suffered with this attack can undermine the confidence of these groups, making room for veiled criticism and, in a more extreme scenario, to attempts to contest their command. To prevent this from happening, the Russian president should use a retaliation not only military, but also internal measures that reinforce his image of strong and relentless leader. In addition to hunting to the culprits within the government itself, Putin is expected to significantly broaden both internal and external repression. In the battlefield, this can mean an intensification of attacks against strategic targets in Ukraine, but also, as it has been standard in Russian performance, a recrudescence of offensive against civilians and essential infrastructure, such as electrical networks, water supply, and hospitals. This type of retaliation, although internationally convicted as a terrorist practice, is often used by Russia as a way to punish the Ukrainian civilian population for the setbacks suffered in the military field and try to destabilize the Kiev government. Faced with such loss, many wonders if Putin could use the use of nuclear weapons, especially considering that part of the destroyed aircraft had the ability to throw nuclear weapons. However, international analysts are unanimous in stating that, despite the escalation of the conflict and severity of the situation, the use of nuclear weapons is highly unlikely at this time. The expression "red line" has been used numerous times throughout this war, but in this case the use of nuclear weapons would be a line that even Putin would not dare to cross. This is because the political and diplomatic cost would be simply unsustainable. A nuclear attack against Ukraine would result in total isolation from Russia on the international scenario, turning the country into an absolute outcast and eliminating any possibility of maintaining alliances or even future negotiations. Putin knows that, despite its bellicose and authoritarian image, there are limits that cannot be exceeded without catastrophic consequences for the regime itself. Thus, the Russian response should focus on conventional but high-intensity and political and repressive measures within the state apparatus itself. While Kremlin reorganizes to react to the devastating coup of the spider web operation, military experts point out that the losses suffered by Russian strategic aviation are in many cases unrecoverable. Confirmed destroyed aircraft include models such as the Tu-95 and Tu-22M, two fundamental pillars of Russia's long-range air force. The Tu-95, nicknamed NATO Bears, is a subsonic strategic bomber capable of carrying long-range cruise missiles, including nuclear weapons. The Tu-23M, known as Backfire, is a supersonic bomber designed for depth penetration missions and naval attack, crucial for Russian deterrent in various operations theaters. Even more worrying to the Russian military are reports indicating that one of the anticipated air-warning aircraft may also have been destroyed or severely damaged during the Ukrainian offensive. These aircraft are true flying command centers, responsible for detecting air targets, coordinating interceptions, and monitoring the skies at great distances. The loss or uselessness of an A-50 significantly compromises the Russian capacity to control airspace in large-scale operations, especially at a time when Russia faces not only Ukraine resistance, but also NATO pressure on its western borders. What further aggravates the situation is the fact that many of these aircraft cannot simply be replaced in the short term. The Tu-95 production lines, for example, were disabled in the 1990s, and although Russia maintained modernization programs for existing units, the manufacture of new copies would be a time-consuming, expensive, and logistically complex process. The same applies to Tu-22M, whose large-scale production was also closed after the end of the Soviet Union. Even the A-50, based on the old-fashioned Retaliation IL-76, faced replacement difficulties due to economic sanctions that limit Russian access to sophisticated electronic components essential for the radar and communication systems of these aircraft. The destruction of these platforms creates a significant emptiness in the Russian capacity to perform long-range attacks, temporarily reducing their ability to design power over Ukraine and beyond. This weakening offers Ukraine an important, even momentary strategic advantage. Without part of its bombing fleet, Russia will need to reorganize its tactics and possibly depend even more on missiles launched from soil or ships, whose availability and accuracy are limited compared to coordinated strategic aircraft operations. For Ukraine, this success represents not only a military feat, but also a political and psychological victory of great importance. By demonstrating that he is able to conduct effective operations within the Russian territory, Kiev reinforces his position before the Western allies, who may see this offensive as proof of Ukrainian efficiency and determination, justifying continuous armaments, intelligence, and financial support. The attack also serves as a powerful impetus for the morals of troops and the Ukrainian population, which, after years of war, find a symbol of resistance and offensive capacity in this episode. On the Russian side, the psychological impact is deep. The destruction of frontline air bases exposed the vulnerability of Vladimir Putin's regime, which has always presented itself as an invulnerable leader, capable of protecting the Russian territory against any external threat. This attack dismantles this narrative and launches a shadow on the competence of the armed forces and Russian security services, who have not been able to anticipate or avoid one of the boldest and successful operations performed by Ukraine to date. Internally, the episode further feeds the climate of tension and paranoia within the Russian government. Kremlin, which traditionally responds to crisis with increased repression, should further intensify control over the population, media, and critical sectors of the government. There are already reports that Putin is performing a profound revision in the FSB structures, requiring detailed reports on how an operation of this size managed to escape the surveillance of intelligence and security services, traditionally considered as one of the regime's fortresses. The pursuit of culprits can generate a new wave of purges within the Russian government, reaching not only the average and lower levels of the FSB, but also generals and high employees of the Ministry of Defense. Putin's need to demonstrate absolute strength and control over state apparatus is a classic response of authoritarian regimes when confronted with obvious failures and public humiliations. This movement serves, on the one hand, to reinforce fear among subordinates, and, on the other, to signal public opinion that the government is taking energetic measures to correct failures. In addition, analysts warn that the vulnerability demonstrated by Russia in this episode may have side effects on its geopolitical position. Historically allied countries of Moscow, such as Belarus and Iran, can begin to question the Russian ability to support prolonged war effort and to ensure protection and benefits to their strategic partners. At the same time, historical rivals, such as NATO and members of NATO, will be able to see in this fragility an opportunity to reinforce support for Ukraine and expand economic and diplomatic pressure on the Putin regime. Meanwhile, Ukraine is already moving to politically capitalize on the success of the spider web operation. President Volodymyr Zelensky has made pronouncements highlighting the courage and competence of the Ukrainian armed forces, while renewing the appeals for more international help. The narrative built by the Kyiv government emphasizes that the attack was not just an act of defense, but a demonstration that Ukraine can and should bring war to the aggressor, interrupting the logic that Russian territory is immune to the consequences of the conflict he began. With Russia temporarily weakened in its ability to perform long-range strategic attacks, the balance of forces in war gains a new configuration. But the great unknown that hangs over the international scenario at this time is, how will Vladimir Putin answer? Vladimir Putin's response to the destruction of approximately 34% of Russian strategic bombers by the spider web operation will not wait. Experts say that, in the face of such a deep and humiliating attack, the Russian president will opt for immediate and violent retaliation, aiming to restore his image of strength in both the internal and external scenario. Putin, who built his leadership on the idea of stability and invulnerability, cannot allow the perception of weakness to settle. It is expected to order new intensive bombings against strategic and civil targets in Ukraine, expanding the scale of conflict on several fronts. Although the destruction of nuclear aircraft has generated fear in the international community over a possible nuclear climbing, analysts evaluate that Putin's likelihood resort to nuclear weapons remains extremely low. The use of these weapons would mean a definitive break with the few political alliances that still support Russia and provoke complete isolation from the country in the international system. Russian military doctrine allows the use of nuclear weaponry in case of existential threat, but according to sources near the Russian Ministry of Defense, there is still no indication that Kremlin consider the current situation as such. The search for responsible within the Russian government is already underway. Rumors indicate that Vladimir Putin is focused on finding internal flaws that have allowed the Ukrainian operation to be planned so close to the FSB headquarters, the dreaded Federal Russian Security Service. This aspect of the attack not only exposes Ukraine's operational capacity, but also a profound failure to protect Russia's strategic military assets, traditionally defended with extreme rigor. The crisis within the FSB can result in high-level purges and deep restructuring as a way to establish confidence in the security service and to demonstrate to the population and the world that Kremlin maintains control. At the same time, internal repression should increase significantly. Putin historically reacts to situations of instability with the hardening of authoritarian measures, both against political dissidents and against civil society in general. There is already an increase in arbitrary arrests, blockages of information on the internet and censorship of the media that dare to report the attack critically. The strategy is to stifle any narrative that points to the regime's vulnerability, consolidating an official version that minimizes the impact of Russia's spider tail and reaffirms Russia's ability. Externally, the intensification of attacks on Ukraine seems inevitable. Putin will seek to retaliate not only with the military objective of weakening the Ukrainian forces, but also with a symbolic component, to reinforce their authority in the face of allies and dissuade any attempt at new offensive in the Russian territory. Attacks to critical infrastructures such as power plants, command centers, and even civilian targets are among the most likely possibilities, following the pattern already observed on previous occasions when Kremlin was militarily challenged. Still, the destruction of bombers such as Tu-95 and Tu-22M, and possibly an A-50, represents strategic losses of difficult or impossible replacement. Russian strategic aviation, pillar of the country's military doctrine, is now a blow that seriously compromises its ability to perform long-range operations. Even with the reinforcement of land and naval systems, the void left by the absence of these aircraft will not be filled in the short term. International economic sanctions further complicate any attempt to recompose the fleet by restricting Russian access to electronic components and critical materials for the war industry. For Ukraine, this episode marks a significant victory, but also increases the risks. By exposing Russian weaknesses, Kyiv also encourages Kremlin's fury, which can further increase the level of violence and expand damage to Ukrainian infrastructure. However, the success of the spider web operation strengthens President Zelensky's political position, reinforcing its appeals for more international support and unequivocally demonstrating that Ukraine not only resists but is able to impose considerable damage to the aggressor. The political impact within Russia is deep. The destruction of air bases located thousands of kilometers from the front line and the consequent loss of strategic aircraft reveals to the Russian people and Putin's allies that the country is not immune to war. The invulnerability image that Putin has so cultivated in recent years begins to crumble, creating an environment of uncertainty that may have long-term repercussions on the stability of the regime. This moral weakening reaches not only the armed forces, but also the Russian political and economic elite, which, in the face of security and climbing conflict, can begin to question the feasibility of Kremlin's strategy. Russian vulnerability, now wide open, offers Ukraine a temporary strategic advantage, allowing the country to reorganize its forces, consolidate territorial gains, and reinforce international alliances. The successful attack is also a sign for the West. With continuous support and shared intelligence, Ukraine is able to lead war into Russia and forcing Moscow to reconsider its military and politicians. On the other hand, Putin's need to consolidate his power makes the expectation of an aggressive response virtually inevitable. Like other authoritarian leaders throughout history, Putin cannot allow the perception of weakness to settle, under penalty of making room for internal contestation and threats to his rule. The retaliation that will be not only a military act, but also a political demonstration, designed to reinforce its authority against dissidents and guarantee the cohesion of the regime. While the world, apprehensive, the next Kremlin movements, one thing is certain: spider web operation has changed the dynamics of the conflict. Ukraine has demonstrated its ability to inflict deep damage to Russian military power, while Russia is forced to deal with strategic losses that weaken its position on the global board. The fragile balance between climbing and containment has never been so thin.